Hey folks, Doug Blake with Body Design University. In this video, I want to talk to you about the importance of doing the hip hinge during stiff-legged deadlift. Now, I got this from a student that had asked me specifically. I've spoken about this before in any number of videos. We go over it extensively during the live course, the importance of obviously proper exercise technique. But this one question student had was, why do I need to do the hip hinge while I'm doing a stiff-legged deadlift? Okay, so a couple of things here. I'll tie it all together for you, but the most important reason is to protect the integrity of your lower back, not pull a muscle, for instance, in your lower back. So let me just a couple of quick definitions. What is the stiff-legged deadlift? It's basically like a normal deadlift, except you keep your knees slightly bent, and then throughout the course of the exercise, the knee flexion and extension component, like you're doing a squat, does not occur. So the only movement that can occur on a stiff-legged deadlift, by the way, holding dumbbells or a barbell doesn't really matter. The only movement that occurs is going to be at the pelvis, so at your waist. So your pelvis and or your lower back. So you can have both of those components of movement occurring simultaneously. And of course, the correct way to do it to maintain stabilization without causing potential injury to the lower back is to maintain a arch in the lower back and literally just move or flex the hip and extend the hip. So we call that the hip hinge, right? And put hinge, I guess, in quotes. So the question is, why is it important? And of course, the answer is very simply is to quote protect the lower back. Again, couple of things to give you some definitions on. Stiff-legged deadlift is the exercise that we are talking about. It is a go-to exercise for strengthening the hamstrings and putting a fair amount of stress on the gluteus maximus. I guess you can say the gluteal group in general. Of course, the only issue from the gluteal group perspective is that you're not generally going to be using enough weight to create significant overload on the glutes. Better off just doing squats or some of the other exercises that are safe and directly noted for hip extension. Again, that can provide significant enough loads. Generally, in a stiff-legged deadlift, you're using fairly heavy loads, but those loads should be directed directly onto the hamstrings with some obvious stress on the glutes. So again, stiff-legged deadlifts is the exercise. If you've never done them before, it's simply holding a barbell or dumbbells and leaning forward, allowing the pelvis to tilt or hinge, which then puts stress on the hamstrings. Knees should be bent slightly when you're doing them. And then, of course, the concept of the hip hinge itself is simply the movement of the pelvis, not the lower back. So when you think about from your rib cage down to basically right below your glutes, you have two potential areas of movement. You have lumbar movement, in other words, spinal, lower spine. This is the lumbar spinal area we're talking about, but spinal flexion. So think about when you're rounding your back, like when you round your back forward at the lumbar and in the lumbar region, that is called spinal flexion, right? And then when you arch or lift up your rib cage, you can do that. Think about lifting up your rib cage and think about the arch in your lower back. So you would increase what we call the lordotic curve or increased lordosis of the lower back. That is called spinal extension in the lumbar spine. So spinal extension is like lifting up your rib cage. Spinal flexion is rounding forward. So we're just looking at that area. And then, right, because the lumbar spine connects directly then into the pelvic or the ilium, you have the pelvis can move. So irrespective of the position of the lower back, the lumbar spine, the pelvis can swing forward. It can go backwards, right? So if you think of my pelvis as palm of my hand, it can move this way. It can move backwards, right? And you've seen this whenever you lean forward, you're going to have a compound effect, compound movement of spinal flexion with hip flexion. So keep that in mind. The actual movement or hip hinge is forward going to be hip flexion. So this basically describes the angle between the torso and the upper leg, and that's going to decrease as you lean forward. So that's called the hip hinge, and you can Google it. I mean, there's a million hits you'll get. Not that difficult to understand what the hip hinge is. However, doing it is actually a little challenging for some folks. If done correctly, if you are able to maintain lumbar spinal extension, i.e., the lordotic curve, while performing hip flexion, you have basically done the hip hinge. If you're able to do that, you're going to feel a lot of stress in your hamstrings. Why? Because the hamstrings, not only do they insert over the knee, of course, the medial lateral aspect of the knee into the tibia of the lower leg, but their origin occurs in the pelvic, or what we call the pelvic tuberosity. That is the lower bony component of the pelvic bone, right? And the tuberosity simply means these pointy protrusions, right? So the hamstring actually inserts up into those, and as the pelvic tilts forward, the pelvic tuberosity goes up and away, and it stretches the hamstring. So just like you stretch your bicep, you can stretch your hamstring, but the stretch occurs at the pelvis, not at the knee. It's one of the reasons why it's a great exercise, and you don't need a leg curl machine. So you get all those definitions: stiff-legged deadlift, the hip hinge, pelvic tuberosity, or just the connection, the origin of the hamstring group itself. So why is it important then to do the hip hinge? And the answer is, right, remember what I said, to protect your lower back. And basically what you're doing when you hinge at the hip versus allowing for spinal flexion is, number one, first and foremost, is by hinging at the hip, you're actually moving the pelvic tuberosity up and away, right, from the knee or the insertion of the hamstrings, which literally lengthens the hamstring. And I guess one of the reasons a student had asked me this was because they correctly, when they do it incorrectly, or when you do it incorrectly by rounding your back, you put a lot of stress on your hamstrings, irrespective of whether or not you hinge at the hip. Why? Because the hamstrings are always going to be under stress when you lean your body forward, irrespective of how much that the pelvic tuberosity moves up and away from the knee, right? The insertion of the hamstring, you're going to put a lot of tension and stress on your hamstrings, but you're minimizing that level of stress because you're minimizing the lengthening of the hamstring. So again, reason number one is you got to lengthen the hamstring, or at least maximally, given the type of closed kinetic chain movement that you're doing. So first and foremost, the hip hinge allows for a greater level of stretch of the hamstring group while you're doing the exercise. So when you're flexing the hip, you are lengthening the hamstrings. Oh, and by the way, yes, you're lengthening the gluteus maximus. So we'll just throw that in for fun. That's number one. The second and most, in one sense, more important reason is, as I said originally, protecting the lower back. If you don't hip hinge effectively, and or you're allowing spinal flexion of the lumbar spine, now essentially what you're doing is you are working, right, the erector spinae muscles. Now, I know, and this is another reason why the student asked me, what's wrong with that? Well, there's nothing wrong with that, unless the position of your lumbar spine, your torso, puts an inordinate amount of stress or torque on those muscles of the lower back. And that's generally what you're doing, because you're not going to be doing stiff-legged deadlifts with 20 pounds or 20-pound dumbbells. You're using a relatively significant amount of weight. And by the way, you've seen folks do this in the gym, using 200 plus pounds on a bar doing stiff-legged deadlifts. That puts an incredible amount of unnecessary stress on the erector spinae. So when the erector spinae, when your lumbar spine goes through spinal flexion, the erector spinae lengthens. So they are effectively going through concentric and eccentric contractions. not necessary and potentially dangerous because of the load. However, when you're doing a hip hinge, you are essentially keeping your erector spinae in an isometric state of contraction for the most part. And by keeping, and this is one of the reasons why I don't care if you do it right, you do it wrong. You're going to feel it in you're going to feel it in your lower back, one way or the other. In the one instance where you're just hinging the hip with a extended lumbar spine, you're going to feel it in your erector spinae simply because there's a lot of tension in that isometric position. However, under an isometric contraction or in an isometric contraction under heavy loads, the muscles are essentially, I'm going to put this in air quotes, better, quote, protected from the potential dangers and stresses that are placed on a muscle when they go through eccentric and concentric contraction. There are also issues related to the actual vertebrae lumbar spine itself. But right now, just in this video, I'm more concerned talking about just the muscles and under this eccentric, concentric loading phases. If we are flexing and extending the spine, putting a muscle, especially those muscles, in an isometric contraction under loaded conditions is going to be far superior from a injury perspective. By the way, do it correctly, maintaining that arched position, or incorrectly rounding the back. If the weight's too heavy, you're going to hurt yourself one way or the other. Turn the torso one way or the other, you're going to hurt somebody. So again, that's irrespective of all the other potential variables where somebody can injure themselves. The point here is that the hip hinge protects, quote, protects the lower back, depending on the amount of load that you're using, by maintaining an isometric contraction in the erector spinae muscles and all the other intrinsic muscles within the vertebral column itself. And again, it also allows for, because of hip hinging, allows for a greater lengthening and stretching of the hamstring, which is kind of what the whole point of that exercise is for. So yes, you'll feel it all over you'll feel it throughout your entire back. If you're holding enough weight, you're going to feel it all over the place. But that's not really the criteria that we want to use as to whether the exercise is safe and effective. Be smart about it. Obviously, start off with enough weight to where the client can actually feel it in their hamstrings. And again, yes, their glutes. But if you don't hip hinge and you allow for spinal flexion and extension, now you're just opening up your client to potential injury that probably would never have happened if you had kept them in that isometric position and simply hinged at the hip. So I hope this was helpful. If you got any questions, you just let us know. Write the word understand there if you did kind of get the gist of what this video was trying to help you with. As always, if you've got other questions, write them in there. More than happy to help out, and we'll see you next week. Take care.